name is Justin Katz, and I'm doing the February topic analysis for Champion Briefs. So I'm just going to jump right into it and start out with the resolution, which is resolved. On balance, economic globalization benefits worldwide poverty reduction. So there are about 6 things that I want to talk about in this topic analysis. I'm going to start off by talking about some of the fundamental reasons why economic globalization occurred, then move to talking about what globalization actually means in the economic sense, speak a little bit about framework analysis that debaters can make, talk about the arguments on both sides of the resolution, discuss strategy briefly, and then finally discuss some of the tournaments that occur throughout the month and how you should approach them. So starting out on the reasons that economic globalization actually occurred. So there are about 3 primary reasons why economic globalization happened. So first of all, in the 1980s, there was a huge oil shock where basically OPEC, which is a cartel made up of the primary oil-producing nations in the world, decided to reduce oil supply in retaliation for the United States' treatment over primarily the Iranian hostage crisis. So basically what this meant is that a lot of countries throughout the world had a lot of trouble accessing oil. This meant particularly countries that were in the developing world, who were particularly vulnerable to economic shocks, had huge economic problems during this period. Now, in the 80s, the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the United States was a man named Paul Volcker. And he decided that in order to aid some of those developing countries, then he'd start to issue a more expansionistic monetary policy, with the primary goal of trying to ensure that developing countries could borrow money in order to help the economic situation that was happening. However, the unintended consequence of that policy was that a lot of developing countries actually just took on a massive amount of debt that they had no real ability to repay. So to some extent, as retaliation for this and to ensure that none of those problems actually spilled over to the developed world, the Federal Reserve started issuing structural adjustment policies, which was basically policies on behalf of the Federal Reserve to increase the worldwide interest rate. Now, at the same time, as countries across, specifically in Latin America and across the developing world, were beginning to default on their debt, the structural adjustment policies were basically the Federal Reserve saying, we are going to forgive your debt in exchange for you loosening some of the economic restrictions that you've placed on your economy. So that basically meant things like, if Argentina wanted to get out of some of the debt that it owed the United States, then it would have to lower some of its trade barriers to enable US companies to penetrate into their markets. Basically, for the most part, this was undertaken by international organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, somewhat similar to what the European Union has been doing in the most recent financial crisis by essentially imposing austerity measures for failing economies like Spain and Greece if they want bailouts. So what happened is that a lot of these developing countries were forced to change their domestic policies in order to get relief from the debt. But at the same time this was happening, the Soviet Union was starting to become less and less influential in worldwide geopolitics. So as the United States, as the Federal Reserve, and as international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank were starting to essentially change some of the internal policies of these countries to be more friendly to capitalistic economies, the Soviet Union was becoming less and less able to actually resist those sorts of capitalist penetrations into the developing world. So the inevitable effect of this policy was that capitalist market structures became more and more prevalent throughout the globe as trade barriers started to fall and as more and more countries started participating in the United States-led global economy as opposed to the alternative that the Soviet Union had once been able to provide. Now, the last reason why economic globalization happened was basically just because of greater technological advancement worldwide. Now, the way that this happened is basically just the natural progression of technology throughout history. So we've seen that, at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century, a lot of economies throughout the world were able to become more nationalized and become more centralized. And that was because of greater transportation abilities, because of the rise of things like train transport and the telegraph, which allowed communications across countries. And basically that process just continued. So you had lowering shipping costs internationally as super tankers occurred and super tankers became efficient. You also had advances in communications technology, primarily as a result of the rise of the internet, and greater ability to handle and coordinate these massively complex international trade systems because of basically the computer. So those 3 underlying facets enabled economic globalization. But what exactly do we mean by economic globalization? We basically mean the greater facilitation of exchange of goods and services throughout the worldwide economy. And when we say economic globalization and promoting economic globalization, that typically means promoting free trade policies. Now, there are two free trade policies that I think are important to understand in order to approach this topic. So the first is basically free trade promotion that has to do with tariff reductions. And I talked about this a little bit before, but basically when a country is starting to promote its own economic policies and trying to create some sort of real industrial economy, they typically impose import and export tariffs, which mean two things. It means, first of all, that if a country or a company wants to import goods into a domestic economy, then they have to pay massive tariffs. Or if domestic companies want to export some of their goods to a foreign economy, then they also have to pay tariffs. Now, this obviously discourages trade, because if a company has to try to sell their goods in an economy but can only do so if they pay massive tariffs, then the inevitable result is that A, they're going to have to sell their goods at such a high price that nobody within that domestic economy will want to buy it, or B, they will simply have to incur those massive costs, and then they won't actually turn a profit by penetrating that new market. So the inevitable result is when you have high tariffs and high taxes on imports and exports, that basically means that there aren't going to be lots of cross-border trade happening with goods. However, economic globalization primarily means the lowering of those tariffs, which facilitates cross-border transportation of goods. Now, the other kind of globalization, or rather the other kind of free trade promotion that's equally important and is equally pertinent in the status quo, is foreign direct investment and sort of regulations that have to do with that. So foreign direct investment is basically when one country or when an individual in one country buys a stock in a foreign company. So for example, if an American wanted to buy stock in a Chinese company, that would be foreign direct investment. And countries can do a variety of things to try to limit this, either through taxes similar to tariff policies, by outright banning it, or just by heavily regulating it to make it very hard and very onerous to actually do this sort of investment. So generally, economic globalization also means the curtailing of the sorts of regulations and barriers to foreign direct investment as well. So moving on specifically to the resolution, I think that sort of background is really important to know, but moving on to the specific wording of the resolution, there are a couple of framework considerations that you all should take into account. So first of all, the framework seems at first glance to be extraordinarily simple. It's an on-balance resolution, which basically means that you're going to be doing a cost-benefit analysis. However, I think there are a couple of really interesting things that debaters can develop in terms of framework. So one sort of vague term in the resolution is this idea of what a benefit to worldwide poverty reduction actually means. I think there are basically two ways that you can interpret this. You can either interpret this in the probably more straightforward way, which is basically just saying, does economic globalization reduce or increase poverty? But I think an interesting way that debaters can approach this is by trying to figure out whether worldwide poverty reduction can be somewhat of a term of art and means something more than just reducing or increasing poverty rates. So what I mean by that is sort of think about worldwide poverty reduction as poverty reduction programs. So that would be things like programs that the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or the United Nations or really any national government level group would initiate in order to try to reduce poverty. So for example, USAID might be a form of worldwide poverty reduction. So when we say that economic globalization benefits worldwide poverty reduction, a potential way that that might come about is if globalization doesn't necessarily directly reduce or increase poverty, but rather aids or hurts efforts to reduce poverty. So for example, if economic globalization makes efforts on behalf of the USAID more effective, then that might be one way in which economic globalization would in fact benefit worldwide poverty reduction, even if you can't show a direct link between those efforts being more effective or those efforts being more easily facilitated and actual reductions in the long term in poverty rates. Now, the last framework consideration that I'd like to discuss is, some people might agree on this, but I generally say that the only thing that you need to prove to get impacts is to show basically some link between economic globalization and poverty reduction in general. So as I discussed a little bit before, economic globalization has many facets. It has to do with greater ease of transportation, greater communication, and greater technological advancement. All of those things facilitate economic globalization, but they're also inexorably bound up in it. What that means is that even if economic globalization as a process doesn't necessarily have direct impacts on poverty reduction, I think you can still draw impacts as long as there's some link between the inevitable results of economic globalization and poverty reduction. So for example, if economic globalization inevitably means that you're going to have more worldwide access to the internet, and it also means that worldwide, and also it's a matter of fact that greater worldwide access to the internet means that poverty is going down, then I would say that that's basically economic globalization as a benefit for worldwide poverty reduction. And like I said, that might be something that's up to debate, but generally I think it's a facet of the resolution that you all should explore. So moving on to arguments, because I think frameworks aren't really where debate rounds are going to be won and lost. So starting on the affirmative, basically there are 3 lines of argumentation that debaters should explore. The first is poverty reduction due to increased production capabilities as a result of this economic globalization. There's also poverty reduction due to better consumption opportunities on behalf of consumers. And then finally, spillover benefits, which is in the same vein that I was talking about the inexorable results of economic globalization, besides just increasing or lowering the poverty rate. So in terms of production efficiency, there are a couple of theories that we need to get out of the way first. So the basic underlying theory here is that with economic globalization, the capability of the global economy to produce will increase. And the reason for that is because of a theory that an economist came up with at the beginning of the 19th century called the law of comparative advantage. Now, I'm not going to go into the specifics because to actually demonstrate that it's true, you have to do a little bit of math or at least look at some tables, which would be difficult to describe. But the basic theory here is that each country has an absolute advantage and a comparative advantage. For example, the United States economy is, by some counts, the largest in the world, and therefore, if it really needed to, it could on its own produce any sort of goods and services that could possibly be necessary. Now, if that's the case, then it would seem as though the United States has absolutely no reason to trade with other countries. But the law of comparative advantage tells us that that's not necessarily the case. If we can compare a country like the United States to a country like Australia, the United States might have an absolute advantage in terms of total production capabilities. But Australia might be particularly skilled in a particular industry and might be able to produce goods within that industry more efficiently than the United States economy can. So if that's the case, then it makes sense for Australia to devote all of its resources to producing that good which has a comparative advantage over the United States with, because that means that basically they're able to effectively trade those goods and get some of the goods that the United States economy is more efficient at producing back. So what this means in practice is basically the reason that the United States and other developed countries typically outsource a lot of their manufacturing. The United States and other developed countries have a lot of capital. They have a lot of the capabilities to produce goods and services in terms of the actual money, in terms of the actual equipment, in terms of the actual technology. However, a lot of developing countries don't have that capital advantage. Instead, they have a huge surplus of labor. They have a lot of people who are willing to work for very low wages. So the law of comparative advantage tells us that the way to produce the most in the global economy is for each economy to do what's best. So that means that the United States should employ its capital advantage while developing countries should employ their labor advantage. That means basically outsourcing, which is the United States sends its capital overseas. Other countries use their labor advantage to turn that capital into the production of some goods and services, and then you trade back and forth. So if the United States is trading its capital for goods and services, those other developing countries are trading goods and services for the United States' capital. And generally, the law of comparative advantage tells us that this is going to be the most efficient outcome that's going to increase the total amount of productivity. And the reason that this would reduce poverty is because basically it means that there's going to be more productivity in all countries, particularly developing countries. In terms of talking about the difference between capital productivity and labor productivity, that means particularly in developing countries, there's going to be better employment, there's going to be more relative employment, because countries with a comparative advantage in labor will get to utilize that labor a lot more, so that everyone gets jobs, even if they don't necessarily have some specialized skill set. Basically, the ultimate result is that people have more money in their pockets because they're actually getting the services that they need that their economy can't produce on its own. So that's why there are going to be poverty reduction due to better, basically, production efficiency. Now, next there's going to be poverty reduction with economic globalization as a result of greater consumption. Now, there are basically two sides to the consumption story. When I talk about consumption, I basically mean that economic globalization enables consumers to access goods at a way that will ultimately reduce poverty. And that happens in both the developed world and the developing world. So first, in the developed world, Globalization will reduce poverty because it'll increase each individual consumer's purchasing power. Now, purchasing power is basically loosely defined as the amount of goods and services that somebody can spend with $1 or whatever denomination of currency their economy uses. So an increase in purchasing power would basically mean that my dollar now buys 2 hamburgers as opposed to 1 hamburger. Essentially, it occurs because there's better international trade. Because when you have international trade between different economies, and if each economy is acting in accordance with the law of comparative advantage, that means that goods and services are going to be flowing from areas in which there's a surplus of that good to an area in which they're more scarce. So basically, if we're comparing, for example, the United States and Taiwan, you're going to see trade between, say, for example, cars that are produced by the United States and t-shirts that are produced by Taiwan. Now, there are lots of t-shirts in Taiwan in this example, which means that when they trade with the United States, those t-shirts are worth comparatively less to the Taiwanese, as opposed to them being worth comparatively more on behalf of Americans. So therefore, when you trade essentially these surplus goods to countries where those goods are scarce, then those goods are worth more in those economies, and basically consumers can purchase more. So if you can purchase more with every single dollar, that means that you have more expendable income, you can support a higher standard of living, and generally you can have, you can see a reduction in poverty. Now, the flip side of this coin is the result of globalization in the developing world. Now, this is a little bit somewhat less intuitive. However, the basic idea is that with economic globalization, each individual country has access to particular services and particular communications ability that they might not have in the absence of economic globalization. Particularly, this is manifested in the fact that now developing countries are able to connect to the internet, basically populations that were historically impoverished, historically just employed in sustenance farming and things like that. They can connect it to the global economy, which enables these people to access certain resources that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. And that's really important because basically if you can transfer from an entire economy being based on just sustenance farmers to an economy based on information, or an economy where people actually have the skills that they need to promote, to increase their productivity, to increase their wages, that sort of thing, then you can actually see the reduction in poverty that's imperative. Now, the last facet of pro-argumentation is essentially in terms of the spillover effects that I was talking about earlier. So if economic globalization brings about poverty reduction through things like greater social links, better communications that aren't necessarily bound up in just the exchange of goods and services, then I think those are benefits that should be counted on the pro as well, and they should be explored. Now, the con is a little bit simpler and more straightforward, luckily. There are basically 3 lines of argumentation. The first line is exploitation that results because of globalization, the fact that globalization reduces global production, and the fact that globalization ultimately just exists as a tool of the wealthy to fleece the poor. So moving on to exploitation, countries can exploit resources because they're caught up in basically this capitalist rat race, whereby they have to do everything they can. They have to squeeze all the productivity out of each of their resources, because if they don't, they're going to fall behind. So this means that countries are especially likely to exploit both their human and natural resources. So in terms of human resources, particularly when we're talking about countries in the developing world, which might not have good labor laws, which might not have a great human rights record, you don't necessarily want to encourage a company to squeeze the most out of their laborers that they possibly can. This means that you're going to have companies encouraging or basically paying the bare minimum of what people need to survive. They'll be working in terrible working conditions, essentially just sweatshops. Children will be working, they'll be working 14-hour days, and probably companies will be bribing the government to do things like forcing migration from rural areas to urban areas, which is basically happening in China right now. Now, the issue with that is you're basically reducing the standard of living of every single impoverished person in that country, which is an increase in poverty. Now, countries can also exploit natural resources, and I'm just going to kind of touch on this briefly. But particularly in countries that have very highly valued natural resources, for example, oil, there's a phenomenon known as Dutch disease, which is essentially when an economy becomes overly dependent on a single resource. So for example, Saudi Arabia has tons of oil, which means that there is no incentive to develop, for example, the domestic manufacturing industry. That means that the entire economy is dependent on the oil industry at the expense of other industries. But particularly for oil and other high-value natural resources, that's problematic because it means that basically you only have a few people employed at the top, the elites who own the oil fields, the few people who actually work on the oil fields, and those are the people who get the profits, whereas you don't have any industrial progress that can actually help the other sorts of people. Only wealthy people get benefits, and poverty is ultimately increased because you don't have domestic industry that can actually support the vast majority of impoverished people. Now, the other possibility is that there are going to be reductions in global production. Now, the basic reason for this is because there's a huge reason why countries in the 80s had these massive tariffs and had these barriers to free trade. It's really problematic if you have basically a domestic industry that's limping along and it's trying to get off its feet, and you have, for example, McDonald's come in and start producing fast food burgers at $1 a piece. Now, it's really, really hard for any company that's just trying to get off its feet to compete with that, which means that they're ultimately going to be driven out of the market and you won't have any sort of domestic industry. Now, that's problematic in the long term, because while in the short term, the law of comparative advantage would tell us that that outcome is more efficient, in the long term, all it means is that in the global economy, you have fewer competitive firms and you have a tendency towards oligopoly. Basically, that means that just a few firms are controlling the international marketplace, which will undercut competition and, by the law of comparative advantage, ultimately reduce overall productivity. Now, if all of the benefits, like I talked about, of greater productivity leading to the ultimate benefits of poverty reduction are true, then that means that if you have a drop in global production, then poverty should go up. Now, the last sort of line of con argumentation is the fact that globalization is really only for the benefit of the wealthy. Now, in the background section, you could sort of see how effectively one of the main drivers of globalization was actions on the part of developed economies. Now, these are basically wealthy nations imposing rules on developing countries so that they could increase access for their own corporations. And this argument extends far beyond just structural adjustment policies of the Federal Reserve in the United States. Effectively, you have huge global corporations that have a massive profit incentive to continue to squeeze whatever resources they can out of the global poor. Effectively, you have really wealthy corporations who are able to manipulate the political systems in countries that might not have super great rules for conduct, which means that those barriers are kept low, and it also means that companies move jobs from developed countries to these developing countries in order to get increased profits. This ultimately leads to greater income inequality, which effectively means that you're not able to utilize a large portion of your workforce, and a large portion of your workforce isn't able to produce, and they're basically wallowing in poverty, which is the exact opposite outcome that we thought economic globalization would create. So now I want to move on briefly to discuss some strategy considerations that each side should be sure to take into account. So on the affirmative, I think it's really important to have a background understanding of the actual economics that underlie the economic globalization and the macroeconomic principles that go into the global poverty reduction effects. Now, you aren't necessarily going to be able to present these sort of facts in the context of a 40-minute debate round, because as you could see, it's relatively difficult to explain in detail things like the law of comparative advantage. However, a really positive way to ensure that you can actually respond to some of the arguments that the con is presenting and think dynamically about these sorts of issues is have a solid understanding on the economics. So the other thing that debaters have to do, besides understanding the economic principles, is to know how to explain the theory behind it and seem competent while they're doing it. So there are basically two things that I think debaters need to keep in account. So first of all, it's really important on the pro to avoid some of the laissez-faire buzzwords that even I've slipped into, which are things like, for example, trickle down, the invisible hand, etc. Those sorts of things, which are basically in the lexicon of conservative economists. And if you use those words, then you'll be immediately pegged by a lot of judges as just a classical liberal economist who's trying to fleece the global poor and extract the maximum amount of production that you can. That's not a good way to build credibility and particularly build empathy towards the global poor on your case. But another important facet that debaters in the pro should consider is trying to build credibility with some of this theory. So a great place to do that is through crossfire. You can basically crush a lot of the con argumentations by just explaining the economics, using some of the technical terms like the law of comparative advantage, which makes you seem extremely competent, which essentially means that when you assert things later in round, then judges will be more likely to believe what you're saying. So in terms of constructing the case narrative itself, there are two ways to go about this. The first way is basically a very simple narrative layout, sort of what I did before, which is that economic globalization will benefit and reduce poverty by basically improving the way that the global economy acts on all levels of the interactions of the global economy. So that's, for example, starting with increasing productivity, going on to benefiting consumption, and then finally talking about spillover benefits. That would be a great narrative to lay out. Now, a more technical way to construct your case could be by talking about the difference between developed countries and how economic globalization affects the poor in those instances and the developing countries. Now, the reason that I think it's good to leave that sort of analysis to a technical round is because a lot of judges will, hear the term, we really need to care about the urban poor in the United States and say, well, that might be true, but it ultimately pales in comparison to the problems that exist in developing countries. But I think a more nuanced judge and somebody who's more willing to accept different sorts of argumentation will be much more likely to accept that sort of argument. So in terms of strategy on the con has two basic advantages. They have a narrative advantage and they have the advantage of deploying the tool of long-term analysis. So in terms of the narrative advantage, it's really easy to construct a case that basically says, look, economic globalization just makes life worse off for the poor because by definition, it's exploitative. It basically means that you're going to see a drop in production and it's going to hurt everyone. It'll be relatively simple to find pieces of evidence on behalf of people who are against recent trends in economic globalization, that talk about the deplorable conditions in sweatshops, that talk about the horrific instances and the horrific things that worldwide corporations have done to try to increase their profits and benefit their bottom line. And those sorts of things can be very, very narratively compelling, particularly when compared to a pro case that's just chock full of statistics and chock full of economic jargon. Now, the other advantage is through the lens of the long-term analysis. So particularly in technical rounds, I think this sort of analysis can be incredibly beneficial. Now, the basic thesis of this idea is, look, a lot of the economic theory behind economic globalization benefiting the global poor might be somewhat compelling. However, economic globalization is simultaneously a very new concept, and a concept that has been around for more than 25 years. That means that the statistics that the affirmative is going to pull up don't necessarily have any standing on what's going to happen in the long term. Now, why that's important is because, as I talked about a little bit before, a lot of the con arguments talk about how in the long term you're going to see harm. So, for example, in the long term, you're going to see reductions in competition because firms in developing countries won't have an opportunity to blossom. In the long term, you'll see rising income inequality that'll cripple the global economy. And those sorts of things are not only beneficial for disarming pro analysis, but also are ultimately very easy to weigh and outweigh the pro on. Because the pro says, look, in the short term, you're getting these efficiency advantages, but you can come around and talk about how in the long term, you'll see harms to the global economy and greater increases in the poverty rates, then that's ultimately going to win your round. So finally, I want to talk just a tiny bit about the different tournaments that occur through the month. So really the only tournament that I've been to in February is Harvard. And Harvard is a really fun tournament. Lots of people go. It's the biggest tournament of the year, including NFL Nationals. But that means two things. It means, first of all, that the field is extraordinarily varied. You'll be debating people from across the countries using styles that you might not be familiar with. But it also means that all of their judges are going to be judging you. So judging is extremely varied. You'll have people who are first-year outs. You'll have people who have a background in policy. You have people who have never heard a debate round before. And what that means is adaptability is key. And if you can adapt through the month, or if you can adapt through the tournament and realize that every round will be different depending on who your judge is, then you can do well. The other consideration, because of the size of the Harvard tournament, is just that it's a marathon. There are a lot of rounds. It's over 3 days. It breaks cleanly to triple octofinals, which means that there are going to be a lot of rounds, and you need to spend the time between rounds preparing for the different sorts of arguments that you might hear, more so than in other tournaments. Generally, just if there are any sorts of national qualifying tournaments, which I know start to happen in February, just a quick note on those, which is that you have to be cognizant of the fact that most district qualifying tournaments are, even if they seem to have a lot of competitive people in them, they still should be debated in a more lay style. That's because nationals, effectively by its nature, is going to draw more lay debaters, and so judges, even if they are experienced, will be looking for that style more so than at other tournaments. So you can't debate them like a circuit tournament. Overall, I think this is a fantastic topic. I think it is one of my favorites, and I think it'll lead to really interesting debates. There's a lot of freedom, there's a lot of ability and opportunity for incredibly interesting analysis, and I'm excited to see what people can come up with.